Televangelist Creflo Dollar is back in the headlines again, of course, over money. You might remember him from a few years ago. He once asked members of his congregation to buy him a private jet for $65 million.
Imagine asking your congregation to help buy you a $65 million private jet, while your ministry is already under years of financial scrutiny.
The Senate Finance Committee launched an investigation into the financial practices of Dollar and 5 other televangelists, saying it was so taxpayers, quote, should be assured that their donations are being used for the tax-exempt purposes of the organizations, unquote.
Now add a Senate investigation, an arrest stemming from a domestic dispute involving your teenage daughter, and a shocking public confession that you'd been teaching your followers the wrong doctrine for decades. That isn't the plot of a TV drama. It's the story of Creflo Dollar, the making of a megachurch empire. Before the private jets and the viral sermons, Creflo Dollar was just a young preacher with a folding table and a handful of believers. In 1986, he held his very first service inside the cafeteria of Kathleen Mitchell Elementary School in College Park, Georgia. 8 people showed up. That's it. 8. From that humble starting point, Dollar built what would eventually become World Changers Church International, a congregation that has swelled to nearly 30,000 members, headquartered in a striking, dome-shaped sanctuary in College Park, Georgia. His teaching style centers on what's known as the prosperity gospel, a theology that links financial giving directly to financial blessing. The more you give, the more God is said to return to you. It's a message that has made Dollar one of the most recognizable televangelists in America, with his program Changing Your World, broadcasting to audiences around the globe alongside his wife, Taffy Dollar, who co-pastors the church and leads her own ministry for women. Over the decades, Dollar's ambitions expanded well beyond Georgia. His stated long-term goal has been to establish as many as 500 satellite churches around the world, and his broadcast reach now extends across multiple continents through television syndication and streaming. That kind of scale doesn't happen without money, and lots of it, which is exactly where things start to get complicated. Estimates of Dollar's personal net worth have varied over the years, with figures cited by media outlets ranging into the tens of millions of dollars, a number that has repeatedly drawn scrutiny given his church's nonprofit, tax-exempt status. Reporting over the years has also highlighted Dollar's ownership of multiple high-value properties, including a multi-million-dollar mansion. None of that is illegal. Megachurch pastors operating as heads of registered nonprofits are permitted to draw salaries and live comfortably. But the optics of that wealth, paired with a theology that explicitly ties giving to blessing, is exactly what has made Dollar a lightning rod for criticism for the better part of 2 decades. But here's the question that follows Creflo Dollar everywhere he goes. If the gospel he preaches is really about grace and generosity, why has his personal wealth become such a persistent talking point? That question exploded into the mainstream in 2015, and it hasn't fully gone away since. The $65 million jet. In March of 2015, a video appeared on the World Changers Church International website. In it, Dollar's ministry made a direct appeal to 200,000 supporters, asking each of them to donate $300 toward the purchase of a Gulfstream G650, a jet reportedly valued at $65 million. The pitch, dubbed Project G650, explained that the ministry's existing aircraft, a 1984 model Dollar had owned since 1999, had suffered engine failure during an overseas trip and needed to be replaced. The backlash was immediate, and it was loud. Within days, the promotional video was pulled from the church's website. Gospel artist Kirk Franklin publicly criticized the campaign, writing that disguising greeds as needs reflected a shortage of character. Media outlets from CNN to The Washington Post picked up the story, and PolitiFact ran a full breakdown questioning whether a nonprofit, tax-exempt ministry really needed a plane built for 18 passengers with 2 Rolls-Royce engines and high-speed internet. Critics online piled on too, asking a simple but pointed question. Why couldn't a traveling evangelist simply fly commercial, the way most missionaries and pastors do? CBS News even sent a correspondent to College Park to report on the story directly from outside the church, noting that 8,500-seat sanctuary filled every Sunday, even as the fundraising campaign drew national scrutiny. The story wasn't confined to religious media either. It became a mainstream news cycle moment, with outlets questioning the broader financial transparency of megachurch ministries operating under nonprofit protections. So did Creflo Dollar back down? Not exactly. In the weeks that followed, Dollar addressed his congregation directly, framing the criticism as spiritual warfare rather than legitimate scrutiny. He told his church, "I can dream as long as I want to. I can believe God as long as I want to. If I want to believe God for a $65 million plane, you cannot stop me." He went further, suggesting that if life were ever discovered on Mars, he'd need to raise $1 billion for a space shuttle to spread the gospel there too. To thunderous applause from his congregation, Dollar said the criticism was really an attempt by the enemy to discredit voices of faith, framing his critics not as reasonable skeptics, but as instruments of spiritual opposition. His ministry's spokesperson, Judah Engelmeyer, offered a more grounded defense to reporters, explaining that ministry teams traveling internationally often transport tens of thousands of pounds of food and supplies, which commercial airlines simply can't accommodate. According to that explanation, the jet wasn't about luxury for one man, it was about logistics for an entire traveling operation of 10 to 15 staff members moving humanitarian resources around the globe. Engelmeyer even told reporters that Dollar himself had shifted to flying commercial for smaller domestic trips in the meantime. Whatever the justification, the fundraising campaign itself was quietly shut down within weeks of launching. The page disappeared. The video lived on only through re-uploads. And Creflo Dollar, rather than apologizing, spent the following months publicly defending his right to want what he wanted, telling critics they simply didn't understand Scripture well enough to get it. For years, that jet campaign became shorthand for everything critics said was wrong with prosperity gospel preaching. It's still referenced today, a full decade later, whenever conversations about televangelist wealth resurface online. But it wasn't the first time, or the last time, Creflo Dollar found himself at the center of public scrutiny. The Senate comes knocking. Long before the jet controversy, Creflo Dollar was already a familiar name to federal investigators. In 2007, Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley, then the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, launched a formal investigation into the financial practices of 6 major televangelist ministries, Dollar's included, seeking answers about executive salaries, personal use of church-owned jets, and lavish real estate. So how did Creflo Dollar respond to a United States senator asking for financial transparency? Through his attorney, he told Grassley's office that if the senator wanted more information, he'd need to either get a subpoena or refer the matter directly to the IRS. According to reporting at the time, Dollar's ministry brought in an estimated $69 million in a single year, and public records showed the Dollars living in multiple multi-million-dollar mansions technically owned by the church itself. Investigators later described World Changers Church International as among the least cooperative of all 6 ministries under review, unable even to confirm who sat on the organization's board. The investigation dragged on for more than 3 years before Grassley's committee ultimately abandoned efforts to push for regulatory change, citing limited resources to enforce subpoenas and concerns from staff that witnesses feared retaliation for speaking out. In the end, the committee simply called on the ministries to pursue self-reform. No penalties were issued. No wrongdoing was proven. And notably, just a few years after that investigation quietly closed, Dollar launched the very fundraising campaign for his $65 million jet, a timeline that critics didn't hesitate to point out. Beyond financial scrutiny, Dollar's name has also surfaced in connection with a personal legal matter. In 2012, he was arrested in Fayetteville, Georgia, following a domestic dispute involving his then 15-year-old daughter, who told police her father struck her during an argument over a party. Dollar was charged with simple battery and cruelty to children. He addressed the incident publicly with his congregation in the aftermath, and the matter was resolved through the legal system at the time. It remains part of the broader public record surrounding his career, even as his ministry has continued operating in the years since. Taken together, the Senate probe and the personal legal matter painted the picture of a ministry operating with minimal outside oversight, long before the private jet fundraiser made those questions go viral. So when the tithing reversal came years later, it landed on an audience that had already been primed by more than a decade of headlines to question exactly how transparent Creflo Dollar's operation really was. The sermon that contradicted 40 years of teaching. If years of financial scrutiny were the slow burn, this next moment was the explosion. On June 26, 2022, Creflo Dollar stood in front of his congregation and delivered a sermon titled, "The Great Misunderstanding." What he said inside that sermon undid decades of his own teaching. For most of his career, Dollar had taught that tithing, giving 10% of one's income to the church, was a mandatory obligation for Christians, one directly tied to receiving financial blessing from God. It was a foundational pillar of his prosperity gospel message. On that Sunday, he reversed course entirely. I want to start off by saying to you, I'm still growing, and the teachings that I've shared in times past on the subject of tithing were not correct, Dollar told his church. He went on to argue that the 10% tithe was strictly an Old Testament law tied to the Mosaic covenant, and that under what he called the New Testament gospel of grace, Christians are not bound by that requirement at all. He pointed specifically to Romans 6, verse 14, which states, "Believers are not under the law but under grace," as the scriptural basis for his shift. Dollar didn't stop at simply updating his position. He instructed his congregation to physically discard his previous teachings, saying, "Throw away every book, every tape, and every video I ever did on the subject of tithing." That's a striking instruction from a man who had authored multiple books and produced years of recorded material specifically on that subject. He also offered a striking self-critique of organized religion generally, telling his church that religion is sustained by two things, fear and guilt, and that his previous framing of tithing had leaned on both. He went even further into the theology, explaining that under his new position, believers are free to give whatever amount they feel led to give, whether that's more than 10% or less, based on their personal ability and the needs of the church body at the time. He explicitly said that if someone wanted to keep giving 10%, that was fine too. He wasn't discouraging generosity. His point, as he framed it, was narrower and more specific. It was wrong to teach tithing as a binding law that carried the threat of a curse for non-compliance, a threat rooted in Old Testament language that he said no longer applied under New Testament grace. Here's what makes this moment so remarkable. Dollar wasn't some fringe pastor walking back a minor point. He had spent nearly 4 decades building both his ministry and, by many accounts, a personal fortune, estimated in the tens of millions of dollars, in part on the foundation of mandatory tithing. So why would he choose to dismantle that very teaching in front of 30,000 members and a watching internet? According to his own explanation, it came down to a deeper study of grace theology, one that convinced him tithing had never been a New Testament requirement to begin with. He was careful to clarify he wasn't discouraging giving altogether, telling his congregation that giving 10% was still fine if people felt led to do it, but that it could no longer be framed as a law they were breaking if they gave less. The reaction online was split almost immediately. Some praised Dollar for what they saw as a rare and humbling admission. Writer and theologian Candace Marie Benbow called the moment refreshing, noting how uncommon it is for a pastor of Dollar's stature, particularly a cisgender heterosexual black male preacher with his level of influence, to publicly apologize for and reverse a long-held teaching. Others were far more skeptical, pointing out that Dollar had explicitly said he would not apologize for the decades he spent teaching tithing as mandatory, choosing instead to frame it as a necessary part of his own growth. Critics online questioned why the reversal came only after he had already built significant personal wealth on the original message. Religious commentators also weighed in on the theology itself. Some pointed out that Dollar's sermon, while dramatic in delivery, actually aligned with a broader and fairly mainstream evangelical position. Thomas Schreiner, a professor of New Testament interpretation at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, had already written years earlier that mandatory tithing isn't explicitly commanded under New Testament scripture, a scholarly position shared well outside the prosperity gospel world entirely. In other words, Dollar's theological conclusion wasn't necessarily radical among biblical scholars, even if the reversal itself, coming from him specifically, was. Not everyone in the faith community was convinced Dollar's messaging landed the way it should have either. Some independent religious commentators argued after reviewing the full sermon that his central point got buried under sensational headlines, and that the more meaningful message, about giving joyfully rather than out of fear or manipulation, deserved more attention than the viral "tithing isn't required" soundbite that dominated news coverage. So which was it? A genuine theological awakening, or a calculated pivot timed for a media moment? Dollar has stuck to his explanation ever since, and years later, his ministry's own materials still teach that giving under grace is no longer a legal requirement, but a joyful response to God's goodness, language that appears on the church's website to this day. Where things stand now, Creflo Dollar's name has been circulating widely again in recent months, with renewed interest in his career, his teachings, and the controversies that have followed him for decades. So it's worth pausing here to lay out exactly where things stand for him today. As of the middle of 2026, Creflo Dollar remains the active senior pastor of World Changers Church International. He continues to lead Sunday services and midweek broadcasts alongside his wife, Taffy Dollar, and his television program, Changing Your World, is still airing regularly on Trinity Broadcasting Network. His ministry continues to hold live-streamed services multiple times each week, and new sermons and ministry content are still being published on an ongoing basis. His ministry has also remained active well beyond its weekly church services. In 2026, Dollar traveled to South Africa to headline a 3-day Grace Life conference, where he continued teaching the gospel of grace message that has defined his ministry since his dramatic shift on tithing in 2022. He has also appeared as a guest minister at major international churches, including Rhema Bible Church in South Africa, reflecting an ongoing effort to expand that message to audiences outside the United States. Back home, World Changers Church International continues hosting conferences and special events, including programs focused on spiritual growth and women's ministry. Meanwhile, Dollar has kept up a steady stream of new teaching through his television broadcasts, live streams, and online sermon series. Recent messages have centered on themes such as forgiveness, overcoming offense, and living under grace rather than religious obligation, showing that his ministry continues to emphasize the theological direction he publicly embraced several years ago. By every available public record, his ministry is operating today much as it has for years. What has kept his name in the headlines isn't a single dramatic turning point, but a pattern of moments that have followed him across 4 decades in ministry. It started long before most of his current audience was paying attention, back in 2007, when the Senate Finance Committee opened a formal investigation into his ministry's finances. One of 6 major televangelist organizations examined for how they handled salaries, property, and church-owned aircraft. That inquiry closed years later without penalty, but it set the tone for the scrutiny that would follow him going forward. In 2012, his name surfaced again, this time in connection with a domestic dispute at his home involving his then 15-year-old daughter, which led to his arrest on charges of simple battery and cruelty to children. 3 years after that, in 2015, came the moment many people still associate with him most closely, the $65 million private jet fundraiser, a campaign that drew national media attention and was pulled within days of its launch. And in 2022, he stood before his own congregation and reversed decades of teaching on mandatory tithing, a moment that split opinion between those who saw it as a rare public correction and those who questioned its timing. None of these moments involve his ministry coming to an end. What they represent instead is a running thread of public scrutiny that has trailed Creflo Dollar since long before this most recent wave of attention. And it's that documented history, not any final chapter, that continues to shape how the public sees him today. Love him or criticize him, Creflo Dollar has spent decades at the center of some of the biggest debates surrounding faith, money, and accountability. His ministry continues today, but so do the conversations about the choices that shaped it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more deep dives into the people behind the headlines. And we'd love to hear your take. Did Creflo Dollar's 2022 reversal change the way you view his ministry? Or was it simply too little, too late?